Let's bring our guest for tonight, Randy Shaw, for the history of homelessness in San Francisco. Give him a round of applause. And there should be a mic right on the floor there. Oh, there you got it. Okay.
There we go. Is the
So,
mic working?
yes. Can we all hear Randy? Great. And like last night, we're going to do this about 50-50 conversation Q&A. We're going to keep it to less than 75 minutes, probably more like 60 to 75 tonight. Randy, if you don't mind beginning by giving us a little bit of context as to who you are, in particular as it relates to homelessness, because I know you've been involved in this issue for a while.
First, thanks all
And
for
then
coming.
keep the mic very close to your mouth.
Thanks all for coming. Really, I'm blown away by how many people are here. So I hope to make it an entertaining evening and an informative one. I ended up starting Hastings Law School in the fall of 1979. And we decided, if you know where Hastings is, right in the border of the Tenderloin, and a number of us decided to start a legal clinic in the neighborhood. And on February 1st, 1980, we opened the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And then when I got very involved, and if you've seen my book on the Tenderloin, which I recommend because it really tells you what an incredible neighborhood this has long been. I got very involved in the neighborhood, spent all my time in law school in the Tenderloin working on a big campaign to stop luxury hotels. And then when I was graduating, I applied and I got money from the Berkeley Law Foundation to become a full-time attorney starting in September 1982 for the Tenderloin Housing Clinic. And then, we ended up, as we'll go through, we now have like 350 employees. We're the largest provider of permanent housing for homeless single adults in San Francisco. And I'll explain in the questions how I got to that point from being a lawyer in a law office to running homeless programs. But I was there in 1982 when we started seeing, wait, there's all these homeless people on the streets. And we'll take it from there. But
Okay.
And so I've been involved ever since.
And you were one of the people that founded the Coalition on Homelessness, did you not?
We started the Coalition on Homelessness. A number of us were very unhappy with Mayor Feinstein's homeless policies, which I have an article in Beyond Chron about today. You could read about the failure of her disastrous policies on homelessness that no one seems to write about, but I did.
Wait, there was a Dianne Feinstein?
Dianne Feinstein, absolute disaster, and we can get into it in the questions. I'll be specific.
Well, I know what your perspective is on her policies, that's for sure.
But
I don't need to ask you what you thought of them.
We spent years trying to change her policies unsuccessfully, and so a number of us, including Paul Bowden, who ended up becoming the first staff person, Bob Prentice, who became the homeless coordinator under Agnos, a bunch of us a bunch of advocates came together and we called ourselves the Coalition on Homelessness. It was not an independent nonprofit like it became, and we lobbied for homeless changes when Agnos became mayor, which he did in 1988, and we'll get into that, but. I've been involved in homeless advocacy really for the last, 40 plus years. Hey, Richard from my office.
Hi, Richard from Randy's office. Let's just sit right over here. Okay, so I love history. I read history books. I enjoy learning about the past. It's a Jewish thing, probably. We like looking behind us.
Maybe that's why I like it too.
Maybe, yeah, maybe it is. I was going to be like, any Jews in the house, but we don't have to do that. It's fine. It's fine. It's complex. What makes a Jew in these days? Well, it's another conversation. I would like to start. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through different periods in San Francisco history, and then and then talk a little bit about how contemporary homelessness started, how we got here, and also you've already kind of set me up for it. But what have different mayors tried to do? Like, one of the things is not just like how many homeless people were there in San Francisco in this time, but I'm also interested, and I presume you are also, like, what have we tried to do to fix this before? I.e., what has worked and what has not worked. And so part of this course that we're all taking together is by the end of it, I want everyone in this room and everyone that joins to be able to speak at a cocktail party, at dinner, at lunch with their friends, to be able to explain this issue. So they can say, actually, when Dianne Feinstein was mayor, this is what she tried to do, and at least this is what Randy Shaw thought was wrong about it. So let's start with 1906. So there was a great earthquake in our city. And thousands of people died, and thousands of homes were lost. And so, what did the city do to house people in the wake of that great tragedy?
Well, one of the things about the 1906 quake is that it provoked an urgent response. I mean, if you ever go to the Tenderloin, the one building remains standing in the Tenderloin, the Hibernia Bank, which is still there. But the so-called it was seen as a temporary crisis, and the reality was that San Francisco, from the time of that earthquake, almost the weeks after, decided they were going to rebuild at the record pace. The Tenderloin was started reconstructed in 1907, and in 1915, the goal was in 1915 to have this giant Panama Pacific Exposition, which some of you may know about. It was just the 100th anniversary 7 or 8 years ago. It got a lot of publicity. But the idea was we want to show the world that San Francisco is back. And they did. They built the Palace of Fine Arts. So there wasn't really a long-term homeless crisis. And I was saying as we started, Manny, that the homeless crisis in San Francisco really began in the late 1970s for reasons we can get into.
Okay, but staying on 1906 for just one more second. I know that they actually like built lots of tents in Golden Gate Park, right? What was that about?
Well, it was perceived as an emergency. And if you've heard me on anytime I've ever talked to the press, quoted, I always say the problem in San Francisco and many cities is homelessness is no longer treated like an emergency. Now, it doesn't matter if we call it an emergency. I don't know if you guys know this, but in 1979, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors declared a housing emergency.
What precipitated that?
The passage of rent control. And well, I'll get into the why, but I mean, the point being is that calling something an emergency in an ordinance or a declaration doesn't mean anything. It's whether you act with urgency, which we're not doing. And we've done in certain occasions, but we haven't done often enough. We sort of act like, well, it's always going to be here. And if we get to where I'll get into how it started.
Okay, well, we're gonna get to that in one more second. But between that time and 1979, when it started, I mean, what was it? Was there not a significant homeless population in the city?
There was not. And let me tell you, the Skid Row was 3rd Street, which was demolished by redevelopment. Those people were not homeless. They lived in SRO hotels. And of course, we demolished 5,000 of them because we wanted to do urban renewal in Soma and create Yerba Buena, if people know that history of the South of Market.
Can you give us like 30 seconds? Because
Sure.
how many people know about that? Because I do not know what he's talking about. Okay.
What happened
great.
was the big picture is
you
across
know?
America after World War II to revive cities. The idea was you have to demolish all the low-income people in downtown because they contaminate our ability to economically revitalize cities. In San Francisco, that took the form of taking the entire South of Market, which was filled with residential hotels, SRO hotels, and demolishing them to build what you see the Museum of Modern Art, the Yerba Buena complex. All of that area became a redevelopment area, and the tenants who were in housing through a lawsuit, many were moved to the Tenderloin in certain hotels.
I
But
see. So that was when was that? When did that happen? At post-war,
that
like
happened
50s,
actually
60s?
in San Francisco in the 60s.
In the 60s. Okay.
In the 60s. We also did urban renewal in Western Addition, but it was more dramatic in Soma. Just cleared out entire, vast stretches of acreage so that downtown would have a wealthy people living nearby.
And just the mechanics of that, like, were these privately owned hotels and like the city bought them and then demolished them?
Well, we can get off on we could have a separate topic on
Just
redevelopment.
a baby
I will
transit.
tell you, I was
Yeah.
probably San Francisco's leading supporter of eliminating redevelopment when Jerry Brown did it in 2011. A lot of affordable housing people supported redevelopment. I was always against it, but redevelopment gave the power of eminent domain to be able to say, it didn't matter, we're going to pay you fair market value, whatever we think fair market value is, and demolish your building.
Oh,
so
so
the
they didn't need
owners
permission.
had no choice.
Oh, they had no choice. They're
No
just like,
choice.
here's your money, goodbye.
Right.
Okay, I mean, I kind of knew you could do that, but did not fully know that was possible.
Well, I'm proud of the fact that I led the effort to stop redevelopment from coming to mid-market. We stopped redevelopment in the Tenderloin. So that awful process never came to those neighborhoods.
Jack, it looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, quickly. San Francisco was the end of the line for Santa Fe Railroad, okay? And the whole Mission Bay area was Santa Fe Railroad, okay? And instead of homeless, there were hobos who rode the rails and ended up down there. Of course, when the bridge got built and Commerce ended up going to the East Bay because they didn't have to go all the way around, that changed the dynamic in terms of those people and what to do with them.
I'm not, okay.
Okay, uh, I'm sorry for the side noise, but first let me out Jack Davis as one of the main individuals behind the mayorships of Frank Jordan. Four mayors. He's a very deeply involved San Francisco political consultant and politico. Thank you very much for that, Jack. So the railroad, when they moved it to the East Bay, it kind of turned it
But
into a no man's land?
I think the big picture is that, you know, we did have a Skid Row in San Francisco, but there's a difference between a Skid Row and a homeless problem. And one of the things that, for some reason, we have to keep relearning and reteaching because people get misinformed. Homelessness has always been a housing problem. Yes, some people have a drug problem and everything, but we had alcoholics around Skid Row, they all were housed. We had drug users in the 1960s throughout San Francisco, they all were housed.
Even in the
So-
Summer of Love?
In
Was it?
Summer of Love, there was no homeless crisis. So, I mean, when people said in the Activist Handbook, which I also brought if you want to read my book, The Activist Handbook, where I talk about San Francisco homeless policy, I talk about the
I
fact.
brought the right guy to the stage.
There it is.
I mean, what?
I talk about the fact that it wasn't suddenly, the Summer of Love was the height of the drug scene, and there was not homelessness in the Haight-Ashbury. Homelessness started when housing became too expensive for the population that needed it.
Okay, so people weren't like all sleeping on the streets?
Unless they were voluntarily, people were drugged out. But I mean, you could get a place in the Haight. If you want to depress yourself about housing prices, take a look at what rents were in the Haight in the 1960s and 70s, like $200 a month. You know, I mean, you could
200
buy.
months. That's a dinner
A friend of mine bought a building
these days.
bought
That's a salad.
A friend of mine bought a big building in Hayes Valley in the early 70s for $40,000. One point I want to make to all of you about that goes from 1907 when we rebuilt San Francisco to 1977. San Francisco was not an expensive place to live. Yes, Pacific Heights had expensive units, but there was no problem getting it for working class people living in San Francisco. If you're on SSI or welfare, no problem living in the city. That all started to change in the late 70s.
And so we have arrived at the late 70s. Here we are. It's 79. And what happened, Mr. Shaw?
Well, here's what happened, and it's an answer to all the questions you may have about the origins of homelessness. Starting in the late 70s, young people decided, who grew up in the suburbs, you know, you might have heard the expression yuppies. Young people who grew up in the suburbs decided, you know, it's really more fun to live in cities. I know the parents might have lived in Great Neck, but the kids wanted to live in New York City. The parents might have lived in Walnut Creek. The kids wanted to move to San Francisco. So you had an upsurge of activity of people wanting to live in cities, coupled with the changing economy of San Francisco, going from the port and to a tourist and financial sector. So you have the so-called Manhattanization of San Francisco, the high-rise development and the like.
That
So-
wasn't the case before then? It was
No,
not,
it
people
was
weren't
not.
like going to Ghirardelli Square and
1970
stuff in 1970?
No, in 1975, San Francisco was a cheap city. It changed radically and rapidly for one other reason. Manny, you know the answer to this
Oh,
for sure.
I thought you were going to say Manny. I was like, I wasn't alive.
No, you know the answer to this. What demographic group was only felt safe, of any city in the United States, what demographic group felt safest in San Francisco?
Gays. I was like, it can't be the Jews. So I'm like, I'm Jewish and I'm gay and I'm Afghan and it's not the Afghan and probably not the Jews. Okay, it's the gays. Yeah.
So San Francisco had, you know, gay and lesbians coming from around the country to the one city they could feel somewhat safer. So you had the financialization of the city, the downtown jobs, and so suddenly, for the first time, rents started at value. San Francisco were scared. There's a scarcity, and
Wait, it was because of the gays?
no, because of the influx of young demographic to rent.
I see.
The
Okay.
demand for rental housing for the first time sharply escalated in San Francisco. And as we went on, so 1977 and 78, things start happening. And so 1979, there's so much pressure, a coalition comes together to try to pass a rent control ordinance, which ended up passing a very weak version of rent control in 1979. But if you look at San Francisco land use laws, almost all of the major ones originally passed between 1979 and 81. the hotel conversion ordinance, which I was very involved in.
What was that? What did that do?
It prevented the conversion or demolition of residential hotels.
Okay, so protected residential hotels so they couldn't be
And
converted.
the condo conversion law passed in that period.
And what is that?
Limiting the ability to convert rental housing to condominiums. You have to have a building of 6 units or less.
Okay.
And then the rent control law.
Okay.
So there was, out of nowhere, the old-time San Francisco confronted a new constituency of renters who were progressive and wanted to protect themselves from eviction. And at that exact time, as cities all across America were getting more expensive, because the same phenomenon we saw in San Francisco happened in LA and Boston, a little slower in some places, rapidly in New York. In 1980, we elect a president, Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan. And that election was maybe probably the most fateful election of my lifetime. Because when Reagan won, his very first 1981 HUD budget, he slashed housing subsidies. And I want to explain this to everybody, because this is like if you walk out of this room with one thing you remember me saying, remember this. At a time when San Francisco rents were rising, not just San Francisco, but all the cities I mentioned, where it was most important for the city to provide, for the federal government to continue subsidizing rents for those who could not afford it, because people on SSI, people on disability, seniors, all the people financially eligible for federal housing assistance. That's exactly the moment when Ronald Reagan and the Republican Party pulled the rug out from the entire housing budget. And to this day, we have never gotten that money back. So when people say, well, God, we've had homelessness for 40 years, don't blame the money. We never got the money back. The money was in the Build Back Better bill that Manchin wouldn't sign. And the part that passed was not housing wasn't included.
People who were here last night, right? I didn't plant this. This is literally we had Margot Kuchel from UCSF say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean,
night.
so here's the thing, that in San Francisco, when you suddenly tell, and the population I was working with in the Tenderloin, a lot of people in what was in general assistance, welfare recipients, and SSI recipients, suddenly they couldn't afford rent in SRO hotels anymore.
Can you give us a sense, Randy? I want to let you continue, but some numbers. Like, if you know, I don't know, it was 1980s, it's a while ago, but like, did the city used to get like $500 million worth of rental assistance, and it became like $250 million?
No,
How did it?
Reagan slashed it by, it went somewhere nationally from like something like 31 or 40 billion to 7.
Okay, so he really gutted it.
And so the thing is that cities were not accustomed to subsidizing rents for their local population. Housing has always been a federal responsibility. The National Housing Act of 1949, cities never subsidized rents. And then suddenly, it's 1980, 81, 82 really, when I saw it start, when, well, wait, the city doesn't, what are we going to do with all these people who can't afford rent? Where are they going to go? And that's when Feinstein made a fateful decision that we still suffer from this day.
And cue Feinstein.
Here's the problem. Feinstein never accepted that homelessness was a permanent problem until almost the day she left office.
But wait, it sounds like it didn't have to be a permanent problem because it wasn't right before her.
Well, here's the thing. You're right. In 1982, it's 1983, it's totally fine for Feinstein to think it's going to go away. I don't know why, with Reagan as president, and he won a landslide victory in 84, the money was not coming back under Ronald Reagan. At some point, 1985 maybe at least, you have to conclude as mayor, this problem isn't going away, it's getting worse. She spent tens of millions of dollars. If you were homeless, you had to line up and you'd get a voucher for 1 night or 3 nights at most in an SRO hotel. When the 3 nights were up, you left and got in line again. Now, of course, that got me so involved in the issue because my whole focus from the start of my work was preserving SRO hotels for permanent residents. So we all know that permanent housing is the solution to homelessness, right? Everyone knows that? Permanent
Well, there
housing.
is going to be a debate on that fact on Friday, but that is what we heard
can
yesterday.
Debate that. Permanent housing, without permanent housing, you're homeless. So here's the deal. The largest supply, the housing of last resort in San Francisco are SRO hotels.
Does everyone know
So-
what an SRO is? What it stands for?
Single
No.
room occupancy.
Single resident occupancy.
Single room occupancy.
Room.
It's a single room. Many of them have private baths. None of them have kitchens. That's what separates an SRO from an apartment, the lack of a kitchen. So at a moment when we desperately need to house people in the most affordable housing option, our mayor takes all of the residential hotel rooms off the market and turns it into temporary housing.
Okay, a few questions. One, at this time, how many homeless people were there in the city?
It's hard to tell because there wasn't an official homeless count. But let's put it this way. It was a major issue, and it became a major issue throughout her tenure about people complaining about homeless people. There were encampments, there was, the Transbay Terminal was still there was encampments there. So there were thousands.
Thousands. So it wasn't like 100 or
No,
200.
no, it was thousands, and you saw because they were using every night in the hotline, they had over 1,000 hotel rooms. Now, what do you think it did for hotel living conditions when people were staying in a room for 1 to 3 nights? Not very good, huh? And what do you think it meant for the drug dealers who wanted to operate in those hotels? Great deal. No one's there to stop them. They're just selling the drugs. So it decimated the Tenderloin. It decimated Soma with the 6th Street and parts of 16th and Mission.
What was the TL like before this all happened?
We were on, well, you got to read my book because it explains.
We know, Randy.
No, no,
we
no, I
gotta
say-
read the book. We got it. We get
I say
it.
that because you might not realize when I got to the Tenderloin in 1980, the main theme, our message, our signs, what they all show were this: the Tenderloin is a neighborhood. The Tenderloin was no longer seen as a distinct neighborhood. When they did district elections in '75, they divided the Tenderloin down Leavenworth Street into 2 districts. No one saw it as a neighborhood. So the first thing we had to do when we organized the residents in 1980 was to get in the mind of the public, this is a neighborhood that needs to be preserved. So that's where we were. We won a historic battle in 1981 against these 3 luxury hotels, the first biggest mitigation in the history of the United States. The Tenderloin was coming back, but then Feinstein destroyed our momentum.
You also are one of the founders of the Tenderloin Museum, are you not?
Yes, I founded that, yes.
We're going to slowly drip out your entire resume over the course of this conversation. What should Feinstein have done? If you were mayor at that time and Reagan had just slashed the HUD
She
budget.
should have started investing in permanent housing because we would have at least 1,000 more units now if Feinstein had not thrown them. You understand, we're spending $40 million a year. At the end of the year, how many homeless people got permanent housing? 0.
So
Why are we spending $40 million? And it wasn't just me complaining about this. I was at a meeting with the mayor at her office, and it was all of us, all of the advocates thought it was madness, but you couldn't get through to her.
to Mayor Feinstein?
To Mayor Feinstein,
So-
she's stubborn as can be.
So tomorrow is the conversation as we're going to do the conversation on what's being done to address homelessness. But just to make sure I have what you think should have been done right, she should have been investing in permanent supportive housing
Well, here's
right
what
when it started, not like a larger shelter capacities.
Well, no, you need shelters also, and she did invest in shelters. But the $40 million, and here's the other sad fact. The 1980s, we were rolling in dough because of the Reagan tax cuts, which we paid for later in the decade. So the Reagan tax cuts brought all this real estate speculative money. So Feinstein and San Francisco had loads of money to blow on this hotline program. Agnos comes in with a different agenda, a housing first agenda. Art Agnos, 1988, he takes over, and we're broke. The state becomes broke starting in 1987. And
Why?
It was, because the Reagan tax cuts front-loaded all this remember the 1987 real estate crash?
I was not there.
500-point decline, which was a lot in those days. The economy crashed because it was fueled artificially by real estate speculation through the 81 tax law.
Oh, like 2009, right? That I remember that
Similar
one.
crash. You
Okay.
remember that one. So basically, Agnos comes in and the cupboard is bare. But
So you don't blame Feinstein for that, though. You blame
she blew all that money. We'd have 1,000 units.
Okay, okay.
But here's the thing. I go in, I'm a lawyer then. I'm not running homeless programs. And I was really pushing this thing called modified payment program because I knew all these hotel owners and I thought I can get them to charge lower rents if there's a third-party check. The tenant's rent GA check will go to our office and we'll give them the balance because they don't have to worry about eviction. So I couldn't get Feinstein's people to buy it. So Agnos comes in And I'm pitching it to his general manager, Julia Lopez of Human Services. And she goes, Randy, this is a great idea. We have to do it. And I think, Julia, I'm so happy to hear you say that. And she says to me, but here's the problem, Randy. You know that if we run it, we'll just screw it up. You have to run it. And I said, well, Julia, we're a law office. We don't run homeless programs. She goes, Randy, if you don't run it, it's not going to happen. So we decided to run it. And when the earthquake happened
In '89.
in 89, by December of 89, the 1,000 people that used to be temporarily housed for 1 to 3 night stays on the hotline were permanently housed in our hotels with the modified payment program.
Okay,
Amazing
pause,
success.
Pause. Okay, so from 1979 to 1989, roughly, there were a couple thousand homeless folks, mainly from the fact that Ronald Reagan slashed the HUD budget. There was a hotline. You called in, and you were able to either get a.
You had to go. You had to wait
go.
in line.
Wait in line where?
There-
150 Otis.
You remember? Yeah, you had
That's
to go
close.
to 150
That's
Otis
is here, right?
and wait
Yeah.
in a long
Yeah, like-
line, and it used to be for one night. And Agnos ran his whole 87 mayor's campaign, said, if you elect me, I'll stop the one to night stands. So it worked. The voters are with us.
So people would wait in line at 150 Otis, right over here, a couple blocks from me.
It could be raining,
From
it
us.
could be cold like tonight, and you're
How many
waiting in
people
line
would wait
to
in
live in a
line?
terrible hotel room.
How many people would wait in line?
There'd be hundreds,
Wow.
several hundred.
So Art Agno says, sorry?
Dope dealers will stand out there too and buy vouchers.
And dope dealers would stand out there and buy vouchers. Wow.
Oh, there was
Um,
stuff they would buy. There was such an illegal underground operation selling these things.
Oh my goodness.
The-
Doesn't
you-
sound like a very good
Sixth
system.
Street was, it was just some.
Okay, so but now we're getting their feet built. So now we're at 89. Art Agnos is in. He says no more of this waiting in line at 150 Otis for a one night stay at an SRO. He takes the 1,000 people and he places them into permanent housing.
They came through us. They came to our office, and we placed them all.
You
We
place
got
them into SRO rooms.
Yes,
So you're like, we're
permanent.
going to fill all these rooms with the folks who need stays.
permanent housing.
Did that, when you did that like quickly, majorly reduce the population of
Well,
homeless people?
Here's the thing about homeless counts. It's really, the numbers are very unclear. If people see an encampment, they feel that homeless is a real problem. They're not counting the total tabulation. So I would just say that my focus was, is San Francisco doing whatever it can to maximize permanent housing for the homeless? That's all I can ask for, is we're maximizing our efforts. And under Agnos, we were. And he
so-
acquired buildings. He did the best he could with no money. But he made one big mistake. Go ahead.
Oh no, well now I got to know what his mistake was.
Well, as Jack Davis knows well, Agnos lost the 1991 election because of, in my opinion, some people disagree, he made a political decision in 1989 to allow camping at City Hall Civic Center Park. It became known as Camp Agnos. And
Jack, is he right?
Yeah, I ran the campaign against it.
Okay.
yeah, he did. And that's because Art tried to indict Jack, but that's a different story. That's not about homelessness. But here's the point. So when a lot of you I see are very much young, weren't here when Agnes was mayor. How many people were here when Agnes was mayor? Because that's good.
Okay, a lot of people,
Because the reality is
more than half the
this.
room.
The reality is this. You remember Agnos lost the election in '91 because everyone thought he failed on homelessness. And here I'm telling you, he was a big success. He started housing first. So the tragedy is he made a bad political decision. And as I say in the activist handbook about that election, San Francisco voters and other voters anywhere else don't believe in the right to camp.
Well,
They
why
wanna-
did he make it so that folks could camp in Civic Center?
Because he felt that until we have certain things in place, they should be allowed to camp there. Big mistake.
Okay.
Can I?
Yes.
Well, let's just go on because, we'll get back to it.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
Well,
this is my stage, Randy. Jack, go ahead.
Camp Agnos was put so that the elected officials and the family of officials would have to walk by and see these poor
Oh,
living out there.
I see.
But
Impetus
It was an empathy play?
off their ass.
I see.
Well,
I
also
see.
remember, in those days, the courts were in City Hall. So court employees had to walk by it. And City Hall was very active in those days with a lot of activities, a lot of employees. So he turned off on a huge portion of the electorate. A columnist once wrote about why I'm a liberal, I'm supporting a police chief, Jack's candidate. So,
Oh,
No, you know, I know there's different opinions on
Okay,
that.
let's we're moving along.
Move
moving
on.
along.
We can
Sisters.
debate the 91 election another time.
Sisters. Okay, we're in the 90s now. My decade. I was around. Great. So after Art Agnos lost, he lost to
Frank Jordan.
Frank Jordan.
Who
and
had
yes,
a crazy plan to do dumb things for homelessness, and fortunately we brought Willie Brown in to defeat him.
And
And
what was Willie's plan?
Well, here's the thing.
Did
Willie-
anyone do anything good?
Yes, Willie
Oh.
did. Willie did. Willie started, at our urging, the leasing program, because in terms of what happened with our modified payment program, by the mid-'90s, it's interesting about the tech boom, because often people say the tech boom started in 1997. But we noticed, or I noticed in 1995, rents were really starting to go up. In San Francisco, rents and home prices from 1986 to 94 really didn't go up very much. It's like was the slowest period we had in a long time, since the 70s. But then it took off starting in 95. So we could no longer get SSI and welfare recipients rooms in SROs because the rents were too high. So our strategy of placing people on welfare and permanent housing was failing because we couldn't get affordable rooms. So I suggested to Willie that we lease hotels. And again, I'll tell you a great story about that, because Newsom, when he was mayor, did a big thing about how THC, my organization, Tenderloin Housing Clinic, was sole source contracts. I didn't want to be we're not landlords at Tenderloin Housing Clinic. We represent tenants. The last thing I wanted to do was have us lease hotels or run hotels. I went to all the nonprofits. I said, would you guys do this? Nobody wanted to. The nonprofits just like to own. So we got stuck. A year passed, people begging me to do it. I finally said, well, try it at the Seneca Hotel, May 1st, 1999. We leased the first hotel, and then we started leasing more.
So you leased. So Willie gave money to organizations like yours to lease hotels and place homeless people.
Right.
Could they stay there as long as they want?
Permanent housing, all permanent.
So at this point in the city, end of the 90s, how many people are living in a combination of SROs or leased hotels that the city is paying for?
Over 1,000.
Over 1,000. And then has that
And
made a dent?
and that doesn't count the units. Remember, Agnos bought like the Cambridge. He bought some hotels for the homeless, so there
Okay.
was more in addition. Other nonprofits had.
Was there a period between 1979 and today where there was a major decrease in the visible homeless population in the city?
Well, it's interesting. I think that when you look at the 2003 mayor's race between Gonzalez and Newsom, homelessness wasn't really an issue in that election. 2003, and I think, homelessness flies in and out as a major issue. Right now, it's a big issue, and was a huge issue in the Los Angeles elections. It's going to be a big issue here and now in San Francisco. But 2003, it wasn't an issue. Newsom had no problem running unopposed virtually in 2007. It wasn't an issue in 2011 when Ed Lee won. Ed Lee ran virtually unopposed in 2015. So we had a long stretch where homelessness was still there, but it wasn't like this front burner issue. Newsom's Care Not Cash made a huge difference. It added thousands of units to the supply, which reduced homelessness.
We're almost at audience Q&A, okay, folks? We've gone from 1906 to 2003 in 35 minutes. So Care Not Cash was Governor Newsom's plan when he was elected, and what was that?
Gavin Newsom did have the political courage to say, we shouldn't be giving a welfare grant of $345 and then people not using it for housing. Welfare grants are supposed to be used for housing. So we're going to say, if you want housing, we will give you a smaller cash grant and we'll give you housing. If you turn down housing, we'll give you a smaller grant. And there's a lot of mythology I see on Twitter where people today, if you turn down housing, you get $105. So we're not giving out $500 to just people who aren't using it for housing. So it was very successful because it funded all these hotels. And it reduced the GA rolls by significantly.
What are the GA
The
rolls?
welfare rolls for single adults.
Okay.
So, it was opposed by many advocates who felt that it took away the freedom of how you spend your money. But actually, the welfare grant was always designed at the state level. You're supposed to spend money on housing. And many San Franciscans voted for Care Not Cash. They elected Newsom mayor, who supported it, and he implemented it, and it was a huge breakthrough.
Okay.
And that is probably one reason why, for a while, homelessness was not on the front burner. Because what I find is when the public feels that something is happening, they have a better attitude. What we have a problem with now is people don't see anything happening.
Is there?
I know that's for tomorrow's session.
Well, okay, but that's recent history.
Yeah.
How do you feel like this mayor has done? Other programs that she has implemented that you think are having a strong effect on the homeless population?
Well, I think the problem we have is as rents keep going up in San Francisco for all of you, it makes the amount of rent subsidies necessary to keep a homeless person housed higher. I want to make sure everyone understands that because I see so much on Twitter like, we're spending X dollars on homelessness, why aren't we getting more? Because the subsidy amount goes up so much. Because it used to be that maybe they needed $500 subsidy, or now you need $2,000 to subsidize a Section 8 rent per unit. So the money doesn't go as far, and this has been a big issue because some people have in their minds like we're spending X dollars and that should house X number of people. No, it shouldn't. It costs $500,000 to $750,000 to build a unit for the homeless, and you have ongoing subsidies and staff. It's a lot more expensive because really, Manny, what people need to understand is what we call the homeless budget is really the affordable housing budget. My organization, we have people who've lived in their place for 20 years, and they get money out of the homeless budget.
I see.
And you say, why don't we convert it to the affordable housing budget? Because then everyone would say you're cutting the homeless budget.
I see. I have I think we didn't talk about Ed Lee.
Okay, yeah, I'll talk about Ed Lee.
Because I think it's the only mayor we didn't really touch. So what did Ed
well,
Lee do
Ed
while
Lee
he
was the
mayor?
greatest mayor for housing in San Francisco history, which I talk about in
Your book.
my other book, Generation Priced Out of Housing Crisis.
Is that a third book?
I've written 6 books, but anyway, check out my books from
You
UC.
cannot say when you leave this room that we did not bring someone here that knows about this, right? Because
University of California Press has been very generous in publishing my books. But the thing is that Ed Lee produced housing. He did leasing. He did every strategy. The late Ted Gullickson and I convinced his people to do the small sites program, which we tried to get Willie Brown to do, but his director wouldn't do it. Small sites has helped. Ed Lee did everything to try to build housing. And I think what's the strategic question that London Breed did was not her fault. It's the Prop C committee. When we passed Prop C, that great measure to fund homelessness and everything, advocates decided leasing, we've done a lot of leasing, but we need to own. Because isn't it better to own? If I said to you, is it better to own or rent? Would anyone here say it's better to rent? Probably not.
I would just say, okay.
But let me tell you why it's better to rent.
I hear
for
it's
San
really
Francisco.
expensive to pay your mortgage payments these days, so I don't know.
Yeah,
but-
I'll tell you this. We spent a huge amount of money buying hotels for homeless. And then so that sounds fine until you realize we have no money. Does everyone understand that San Francisco doesn't have a dollar to acquire one unit till the next budget year? We don't have $1. You wonder why they're not acquiring any more housing for homeless? There's no money. No money. Now, why is there no money? A decision was made to spend it on ownership with a huge upfront cost rather than leasing, where the money may be more over time, but you're housing people now, next week. We could have funded 1,000 more units on leasing. We went the ownership route.
Wait. I think you're talking about the city owning units to give people to live in?
Yeah, and they have nonprofits run them.
I see. So you basically,
We did
you're
it.
like,
We bought it. We bought the Diva. We bought the Ansonia. We bought the Gotham. And everyone likes the idea. Better to be an owner. But you know what? It's not better to be an owner of an old SRO because every 10 years you have to spend millions renovating it. Elevators go out. They're a very depreciable asset. So what we have done, I know this is about today, if you ask me, what we have done in getting away from leasing is provided less ability to house people because the money doesn't go as far.
Okay, I'm gonna bring it up to audience questions to kind of help fill in the gaps and ask questions about the history that you haven't yet. I'm gonna have Precious go around. Are you okay? You hit funny bone? Uh-huh. But before we do that, I have a process question and a philosophical question. Process. If the thing that started this in such a big way in the early 1980s was the Section 8 housing vouchers or the HUD budget being cut, why didn't we spend all this money and time just trying to get like the next Democratic president to bring that budget back so that it wasn't falling all on the city's shoulders?
we
Sounds like
did.
everyone was trying to fix it here, but
Okay.
why not?
We did. I was part of it. Nancy Pelosi did everything she could to get this money in that Build Back Better, but Joe Manchin, who said he first supported it, betrayed
Yeah, but
us.
that's 2022.
Okay,
I'm talking
well,
19
Okay,
when Bill Clinton was president.
Let's talk
Why-
about this.
I don't know why we're yelling at each other. Why are we yelling at each other? Randy, 2 Jews on stage. This is what's gonna happen.
Bill Clinton, since you brought up Bill Clinton, you know what he did?
And this book that I just wrote about Bill Clinton.
Hey, Bill Clinton's solution to homelessness, he destroyed 100,000 public housing units for families. I know some of you here may like Bill Clinton. I'm not a fan. Didn't do anything. Remember, didn't do anything to deal with the homeless problem. 100,000. His Hope 6 program was a disaster. Any housing advocate all opposed it, but it passed. To save public housing, he destroyed 100,000 units. Now, the question we have is, you worked for Barack Obama, did you not?
I did.
So why didn't Barack Obama make this a priority when we had complete control of Congress in 2009? Why didn't he significantly increase the HUD budget in 2009?
I don't know.
Well, it's a good question because he failed. Now, I would say this in Obama's defense. The National Low Income Housing Coalition really did an amazing job mobilizing under Biden. That mobilizing wasn't equaled under, but here's the problem. When Obama got elected, his budget agenda was healthcare, education. It's never housing. And we got short. I'm always thinking how we blew it in 2009, and then by 2011, we didn't have the control of the House anymore. So it's never a priority because we don't have cloud in Washington, we don't have unionized builders, and so education and healthcare are always the Democratic priorities ahead of housing.
I see. Let's
So-
go to audience questions. Raise your hand. Precious will come to you. Let's go right here in the front to start. And Precious is going to hold the mic to your mouth, if that's okay.
Hi, I guess my question about the history of homelessness here is like, we talk about homelessness like it's this one population of people. Do you have any information about like the demographics and kind of how that has changed from the 90s until now?
Well, I mean, the big progress in demographics is because we've targeted veterans homelessness is way down. It's the one category. I'm not sure family homelessness is it's been worse since Clinton's welfare plan, but the demographic I think is somewhat the same. I don't see much difference because, I mean, I should also mention, thank you for bringing this up because you reminded me, not only did Clinton eliminate 100,000 units of family housing, he eliminated the welfare entitlement. So families that used to be guaranteed a federal welfare grant no longer are, and when the 5 years expires on welfare, you're broke and you become homeless. So low-income families are more at risk than ever before.
All right. Scott in the back with the jacket.
I'd love to hear more about your books. No, you've talked a lot about the financial history. I'm curious about, in my argument, that is sort of a zero-sum game. What about the supply side, whether that be the history of CEQA, whether that be zoning, whether that be nasty neighbors?
Well, clearly, I know it's very common among YIMBYs to believe that obviously you need to build more housing, and I think the middle class and the working class, and it affects the fact we haven't built enough housing. But rent subsidies have to always be a part of our current homeless solution. So when I hear people say we have 3,000 vacant units and if we just fill them, we could reduce our homeless problem. Well, how does filling market rate units solve our homeless problem? It's about rent subsidies, and we try to overcomplicate things. Well, we have addictions. Yes, many people are too addicted to stay in housing, but we have, in my organization, which has a lot of drug users in the tenant population, we have a 97% retention rate in 1 year. Which means people, if they're really that drugged out, they wouldn't survive that year. So obviously, we've always had people who use drugs and can stay in their homes. But we have to build a lot more housing. Obviously, that's what my Generation Priced Out book is about. But homelessness has rent subsidies as an essential part. That's all.
All right, let's go to this side of the room. Eric, and then there was another hand behind you, I think. So Eric here. You can just hand it to Eric. Oh, wow.
What other cities, if any, have SROs as the housing of last resort, and what implications does that have for our policy?
Well, LA has kept some. I worked on them on their ordinance to protect them. New York City, unfortunately, they protected them a little too late because they had a court decision throwing out their ordinance. Seattle tore down theirs. That's why they have a terrible homeless problem. San Francisco's done the best job because in 1990, under Agnos, we got the law totally strengthened and revised, so you really can't convert hotels anymore. And we saved our population. And it's one of the big successes of San Francisco. San Francisco's done a lot of good things. We strong rent control, tenant protections, but without federal rent subsidies, very difficult on homelessness.
Sorry, was there one more? Okay, let's get the one in the back over there, and then we'll come back around here. We all have to get our 10,000
Hi
steps
there.
in somehow.
So I have a comment and a question. So my experience of being here in 2003 was that the Gonzalez and Newsom race, that it was sort of on the backs of homeless people, as I recall, because of the sit-lie measure that was under consideration, and that seemed to catch a lot of fire. And it was right after that, as well, as that recycling used to be done differently in the city. Because before that, you have to say that that's a homeless issue per se, but it was more of a nuts and bolts. You could collect cans for cash kind of thing. But the question I had was that you were talking some very favorable of R.I.P. Ed Lee. Sorry for his loss. But so it seems like he did a lot for buying buildings and getting people housed. But at the same time, all the structural changes that took place in San Francisco at that time, meaning that like the corridor, the Market Street, 9th Avenue corridor, 9th Street corridor, was all this money was put into infrastructure for Twitter and for big business and Gentech. And they were given tax subsidies. So I'm just wondering if those things, and it created all these new jobs, but probably not necessarily creating new housing opportunities. I'm wondering if that actually did play a role. I'm certainly very interested to know more about what Ed Lee did, but I was wondering if those other factors played a role in increasing homelessness.
Well, I think my own view, and we don't have to agree. I mean, there's a lot of mythology about the so-called Twitter tax credit, which there was no infrastructure built around Twitter. It moved into an existing building, and they did their own internal reservation. There was no infrastructure. So I think the big argument I faced at the time, because I strongly supported the Twitter tax credit, was it's going to gentrify the Tenderloin. Has it? I did. I mean, it's like I see these stories how it's gentrified the Tenderloin. I'd say, have these people ever been to the neighborhood? When was this? And it didn't happen before COVID. So there's just this kind of people want to believe what they want to believe about certain things, but I don't think that could add it to homelessness.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean. I
go
didn't mean to
ahead.
interrupt you. Did I interrupt you? Are you done?
No, you
Oh,
go ahead.
I did. I'm sorry. Corner.
Hi, I live in the Tenderloin. I really enjoyed reading your book several years ago, and
Which book?
the Tenderloin one. Anyways, I talked to a city official high up in the homelessness department a few years ago, and I asked him, "Is the Tenderloin a containment zone?" He said, "Informally, yes." And I won't say his name, but
Well,
I
the
was gonna
Tenderloin
ask you what
was,
your-
that's a whole big thing about the Tenderloin being a containment zone. And if you read me in Beyond Chron, which I hope you guys do, beyondchron.org, I've written more about the Tenderloin and containment zone as anybody, but we do have a police crackdown finally happening now. So I think we have finally got the forces aligned at City Hall to stop it from being a containment zone. But it's
When you
too
say
soon to
containment
declare
zone,
victory.
when both of you say it, what are you referencing
like
exactly?
you can go to there's certain bars in the neighborhood, restaurants. You go there and there's like just 5 guys loitering around selling drugs, wearing face masks. They'll tap you on the shoulder and ask you if you want to buy drugs.
Yeah.
Across the street, there's a bunch of people lined up just.
I will
using
say
them.
one thing about that, how that relates to the homeless crisis is, when we house people in hotels and they have to be in an environment where there's drug dealers outside, many of them prefer not to be in those hotels and to be back being homeless. We've kept trying to say permanent supportive housing sites should not have drug dealers out in front. And we've been like a broken record on this, like you can't believe. And it shows you that the city thinks their answer is over just by housing someone, but you have to give a safe living environment which extends beyond the borders of their room. And when there's overdoses there, it's because they're so close to drug dealers. And we don't have any recovery hotels. I know that's for tomorrow, but I mean, the biggest scandal in San Francisco is how can it be that if you want to get off drugs, you can't go to a hotel where you can get off drugs? None of our hotels are that way. Anyone can do what they want. Does that make any sense to anybody here that we don't have some options for people who don't want to be on drugs or alcohol? So hopefully that'll change with the new homelessness commission that we're setting up.
All right. Over here.
Yeah, I was wondering, in the 1980s, did any cities react in a way to the slashing of HUD in like a way you can point to as being particularly productive, or in a way to like avoid what happened here?
Well, everyone was excited about New York City's right to shelter, and they had a lawsuit, we got a right to shelter, and actually, it was a complete failure. I mean, people think it's a success, the right to shelter. At the end of that period, even the guy who brought the lawsuit said, do you understand? New York City put all their money into shelter and nothing into permanent housing because they had this right to shelter. Sometimes people forget that shelter isn't a home. If you're in a shelter, you're still homeless. That's people forget that. It's like, oh, we got them in shelters. Well, that reduces our homeless population. No, it doesn't. So, one of the big things that advocates in San Francisco have always pushed for is housing first. Yes, you need shelters, but if you don't have the available exits, your balance is wrong. So I think New York City went the wrong way, and yet many people think they went the right way because they don't know the facts.
Can I press you on that a little
Yeah,
bit?
press me.
Trying to just again channel not me personally, but what someone might say to that, which is, one, isn't it better to be in a shelter bed than out on the street?
Yes.
And two, and this is hard to say, a little delicate, it might get me in trouble, but the main constituent that should matter around homelessness is the person that is homeless. And we all live in this city. And so folks who live in a house with a homeless person sleeping in front of it, a small business owner with a homeless person camped out in front of it, a school with folks who are homeless perhaps camped out in front of it, like those are also people that interact with the issue of homelessness that might say in reaction to what you just said, well, why do I have to deal with a homeless person? Why doesn't the city just at least build enough shelters so that, yes, it's not a home, but they're not right in front of my building?
Well, here's the problem. When you're in a shelter, you're not locked in. It's not a prison cell. So people say, I don't want to see homeless people. Put them in shelters. Well, okay, so they spend the night. They don't spend the day in the shelter.
Sure, but they don't have a
And-
tent. They don't have a tent. That's I mean,
no,
I don't
no,
want to channel too much, but it seems like a
I-
lot of the
no,
angers are on the
no,
tents.
No, I get the point. It's like Raphael Mandelman's A Place for All. Obviously, but here's the problem we have. Many people don't want shelters. They prefer to be in tents. And then what do you do then? And that's the issue. And I think that if we had unlimited money, then we'd put everyone in shelters and then buy the house, lease the housing, buy it if money were no object, create the housing units that we have, and then transition people like we used to do when we started in the 90s or 80s, not with the modified payment program. But the reality is there is financial limits. So right now in San Francisco, when people say, we want to add 1,000 shelter beds, there's no money. Is this news to anybody here that we have no money? We have none. If that's news, I'm breaking it to you. There's no money in the budget. Prop C has been spent because the Prop C tax measure, which many of us, including myself, thought would be a possible big dent in our crisis, if you don't work in the city, you're not taxed. So those 9,000 Salesforce workers who don't work in San Francisco anymore are not taxed.
Can someone remind me to ask Shireen McSpadden about this tomorrow, who runs the Department of Homelessness Services?
She'll tell you that. She'll
Yeah.
say we have no money.
Yeah, okay.
She'll tell me that.
Let's get a couple more questions over there in the back, right here.
Great. I wanted to ask a kind of attached question to that because I feel like San Francisco is under this intense amount of pressure to like build all the housing for everywhere. Hey, and yet a lot of people that live in this city work outside of this city. So there's been a regional problem, right, with like cities that don't want to build residential infrastructure while they are also stacking on corporate jobs. So I feel like there's this kind of, San Francisco has its own nut to crack on this, but also is trying to answer these housing cost increases for a huge number of people that are working elsewhere, right?
Well, it's interesting you
So-
say that, though, because Berkeley and Oakland have had built dramatically more housing than San Francisco. And
actually specifically I'm picking on the South Bay.
right. Well, they have South Bay's a separate, yeah. But I mean, we haven't done a very good job in building housing in San Francisco. So I mean, I wouldn't look at other cities. We've done a terrible job and a lot of resistance and people. But it's not. That's sort of somewhat a separate issue than why we have a homeless crisis right now.
Okay, we have less than 10 minutes. Let's get a few more questions. Right over here. Right where in the second burnt sienna couch with the sweater and the white shirt.
Yeah, I just want to get under the skin. Oh, thank you very much. I just want to get under the skin on the money that we need. I understand we have no money, but I just want to get
No
under-
money in the HSH
yeah, but
budget.
if the Fed, so we need money. So in terms of history, but if we need money going forward, we have incremental people who need housing, and then we have obviously a lot of poison in our drug system. Then all those people would need supportive services. That's even more money. I want your view on looking at history of the people that got into SROs. Do they get out of SROs since that's a fixed asset and people can
That
go
is
through?
a great question. I'm so glad you asked that because I overlooked something in our history. When we started our modified payment homeless program, I interviewed every person before they moved into a hotel. So I got to know all of them because I wanted to make sure. And it is true, the population was very different starting in the 80s. Incredibly different population. Far more highly functioning people. Many of the people that we would place, they were like working in warehouses. Remember the whole deindustrialization? They work in warehouses, factories in the Midwest. They came here and they were homeless for a short time and they got a job. That's changed dramatically. And that's why it's so much harder and expensive to house homeless people. Because like our population, people are always saying to me, would you folks get jobs? Well, the average age is 59. 59. So we're not talking about young people starting a career and they got homeless and they're looking for a job. These aren't the urban alchemy people who get hired right away. It's older people who aren't employable. And many have alcohol and substance abuse problems. And so another thing people may not realize, in our hotels and all the leased hotels, there's no requirement you use support services. So when you keep hearing, these nonprofits don't have enough support services, well, it doesn't matter how much you have if you're not required to use them.
Well, the person who was here last night said that requiring people to have supportive services actually can backfire because it makes them feel like backed up in a corner. But where it's voluntary, actually people use it more. Is
Well,
that
here's
true?
what I would say. If you want to be in a recovery hotel, the city should have an option where you can be in a recovery hotel where there's no drugs, no alcohol, and you have to be in a program with a support service worker. If you don't want to be in that kind of program, be in the rest of our hotels. But at least have a few hotels where that option, does anyone think that's unfair? Shouldn't we have that as an option for
Yeah,
people?
Seems sensible.
And, we got to get our homeless commission to adopt that because our HSH opposes doing that.
Let's get one more question from someone who hasn't asked the final. Oh, the way over there. Okay, final question in the corner.
Thank you for asking that question about the state, because to show you where homelessness has been as a state issue, we had Jerry Brown as governor for 8 years. Everyone loved Jerry Brown, right?
16.
He didn't spend, the second 8.
The second 8.
He didn't spend $1 on affordable housing. He was an enemy of affordable housing in Oakland. And yet he gets away with it politically. He's a champion, he's this and that. Now, Newsom has spent more money on homelessness than any governor we've ever had. He's the first governor who's cared about it. So state makes a difference, but when Newsom says he's giving $500 million, it sounds, that's a lot of money. It is, count $500 million and how many units that actually creates.
Yeah.
So the state could do more. By the way, we do have a guy from the homeless who's been nominated for the homeless commission. Vikram, do you want to just raise your hand?
Oh.
Who we're really supporting
Where
for
is
that
he?
job.
Oh, there you're
There
hiding
was
behind the pole.
There was an article kind of talking about stuff that happened to him in 2016. Ignore that. This guy will be a great asset on the homeless commission because we need new thinking. We need to get into recovery and be more cost effective because we don't have the money to do everything to buy these places anymore.
All right, I'm gonna take moderator's privilege to ask the final question. I promise you I'd ask a process question and a philosophical
Any question is open.
And I didn't ask the philosophical question, so I'm gonna do it now. And we're under 75 minutes, everyone. Okay. Do you think it is the role of a city to provide housing for the people who are in it that might need it?
You know,
If yes, why? And if no, why not?
Did everyone hear that question? Because that's the most profound thing anyone has said tonight, and I want to congratulate you for saying that. And I want to say that it's good for Manny, because Manny can get away with saying that. I had a comment that was once in a newspaper that said, when people don't show up in Beverly Hills thinking that they have a right just to be in Beverly Hills. Because people think, well, Beverly Hills is an expensive place, so why would I think that if I have no money and no assets and no resources that Beverly Hills is obligated to house me? But we feel San Francisco, everyone who shows up, we have an obligation to house. And nobody wants to sort of address that issue because it sounds like, wait a minute, you're trying to say we should just put up a drawbridge here, But I think San Francisco has really never honestly dealt with that question. Politicians don't want to touch it, and the answer is always, we're going to do the best we can to house people who come. But when Brenda Breed had the experience where she housed like 6,000 people, and then 6,000 more remaining. Realize if we house every unhoused person tomorrow, you think there won't be more tomorrow or the next day? So there's San Francisco has to decide like how much of its land and property does it want to devote and subsidies. I had a media person say to me, Well, Randy, you're talking about all these people, like, you're talking about, you have 20,000 people in San Francisco who have no income, who the city taxpayers have to support forever. What do you think about that? We don't like to frame it in those terms because it sounds heartless and drawbridge mentality, but I think privately, a lot of voters feel that way. So thank you for raising that.
Can we give a round of applause to Randy Shaw for dropping all this knowledge? Wow.